This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and during the 3 years since, the US and Europe rallied around Ukraine, supplying it with military and financial support to take on the Russians. Russia was also placed under severe economic sanctions, and the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin. But as of today, Russia holds 20% of Ukrainian territory, and for the first time, the United States has turned quote unquote neutral in this entire conflict. It has even voted against a UN General Assembly resolution that condemned Russia for its attack on Ukraine. President Donald Trump has also made it clear that Ukraine joining NATO, which was the main provocation, at least for the Russians, for going ahead with this war, is no longer on the table. At the same time, Trump has also said that the war could end in a matter of weeks. So, what does the present conjuncture mean for Ukraine, which has paid the highest cost in terms of lives lost, economic losses, and loss of territory? Can the US and Russia sit together and negotiate the end to this conflict without Ukraine and Europe also having a say? And what are the bare minimum conditions from both sides that would have to be met for a sustainable peace? We look back and also look forward at this conflict in this episode of In Focus. And we are joined once again by Stanley joining the Hindu's International Affairs editors. So, hi again, Stanley. Welcome back to In Focus. So, to start with, I was just wondering if you can give us a quick overview of the position on the ground right now, militarily speaking. Ukraine has been claiming, Volodymyr Zelensky, their president, has been claiming that they have seized hundreds of square kilometers of Russia's Kursk region. And Zelensky has also raised the possibility of an exchange of territory with Moscow when they sit down for negotiations to end the war. But is Ukraine still in possession of territories in Kursk, or has Russia taken it back? Can you give us some idea now that we have reached this stage of 3 years of the war? What exactly is the situation on the ground in terms of possessions of territory, etc., for either side?
Hi, Sambath. Thanks for having me here. First of all, and if you look at the battleground situation, yes, the Ukrainians had taken some, let's say, 1,000 square kilometers of territory in the Kursk region, which is an open land, and the Russians have claimed that they have taken back at least half of the lost territories, which means Ukrainians are still holding on to some 500 square kilometers of territories in Kursk, where the battle is actually going on. But on the other side, if you look at the Ukrainian side, the Russians made rapid advances in the context of the incremental advances they were making over the last 3 years. So they made quick advances in 2024. They captured, thousands of square kilometers of territory, especially in the Donetsk region. They had also captured parts of Kharkiv in the northeast, and in the south in Kherson. So if you look at Ukraine's east, see, the Russians took over the next Crimea in 2014 through a referendum. And then the invasion began in 2022 February. And then in 2022 September, after the Russians faced the initial military setback, they annexed 4 more territories, which is the Donbas region that includes Donetsk and Lugansk, and then Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south, of which they control almost the entire Lugansk and Donetsk, most of Donetsk. And they control parts of at least half of Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south. And beyond this, they also control parts of Kharkiv and Mykolaiv. This is the actual situation on the ground. And in 2024, what you witnessed was Russian progress mainly in the Donetsk region. So just recently, they captured Toretsk, and the Russians are trying to encircle Pokrovsk, which has been going on for quite some time. They started moving towards the city late last year. And in Chasiv Yar also, they are pitched battles going on in Chasiv Yar region as well. So clearly, the Russians have an advantageous position on the battlefield. And when Zelensky says that he wants to switch territories, what he means was that he is ready to withdraw his troops from Kursk region in return for Ukrainian territories. The Russians on the other side have said that the territories Russia has captured is non-negotiable, which means these four territories plus Crimea. So what is negotiable could be the parts the Russians have in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, which also we don't know. It could be part of some final agreement. But as of now, even yesterday, the Kremlin repeated that these are Russian territories, like the four oblasts and Crimea are Russian territories that are non-negotiable. So if you look at the on-ground reality, the Russians are actually advancing. They have a clear advantage on the battlefield, while on the other side, the Ukrainians are facing a lot of uncertainties. They are facing manpower crunch. They are losing territories, and the continued support from the West is also a big question.
Right. So, Stanley, with regard to this territory in Kursk, which Ukraine has, you said they may have about 500 square kilometers now. Is that like just barren land? Is it of any significance at all militarily or in terms of resources or anything? Or is there anything to it?
It doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like militarily or in terms of resources it is significant. But at the same time, it is a major humiliation for President Putin that we have to accept it, because at the end of the day, these are Russian territories and he lost Russian territories, and the Russians failed to foresee the Ukrainian advance into Kursk and they couldn't defend their own territories. So when the Ukrainians took over Kursk, basically that turned out to be a major humiliation for the Russians. But the Ukrainian advance into Kursk was apparently it was an effort to put pressure on Russia at a time when the Russians were making rapid progress in the east, especially towards Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians made a gamble, but as part of this operation, they had to pull back some troops from the east, which turned out to be counterproductive, which made it easier for the Russians to advance on the east. So, actually, yes, the Ukrainians captured some 1,000 square kilometers of territory, of which they have already lost half of it. But as part of this gamble, they had to pull back their much needed resources from the east, where the Ukrainians were actually facing manpower crunch. And that allowed the Russians. What the Ukrainians thought was that the Russians would come to Kursk so that they can actually stall or arrest the Russian advance in the east. But the Russians stayed course with their operation in the east. And apparently, according to international reports, they got North Korean soldiers to fight in the Kursk region. So the Russian focus remained on the east, and then they built a new front in the Kursk region to take back the territories, and they captured half of the territories back. So if you look at both scenes, the Ukrainian gamble turned out to be counterproductive. It did not help them much.
Right. Now with Russia, as you said, holding on to these four provinces, Stanley. So then, if you look at it, you will, in terms of a strategic objective, going into the whole scene of negotiations for peace, Russia would then, instead of looking to hold on to these territories, would it be looking to establish that land corridor from Russia to the Black Sea, to its Black Sea fleet? Is that secured now?
The Russian land bridge is now in operation. It's there. Yes, Russia's Black Sea is based in Crimea, and Crimea was annexed in 2014. And Crimea has been linked to Russian mainland through the bridge across the Strait of Kerch. And that was initially the situation before 2022. But the bridge was vulnerable to Ukrainian attack, and it had been targeted by the Ukrainians a couple of times since the war began. And now what you have is that there is also a land bridge, not only the bridge, across the strait. Now the land bridge means the mainland Russia is now directly connected to Crimea through the Donbas region. So yes, the land bridge is in place, and the Russians have made it clear that they are not going to pull back from the region. So Crimea has been from a geographical point of view, Crimea has been annexed to mainland Russia now, because the Russian territory now flows from mainland Russia through eastern Ukraine, through Donetsk, Lugansk, and then the southeastern Ukrainian parts to Crimea. So the land bridge is in place. The bridge across the strait is also there, and the Russians have made it clear that they are not leaving these four regions as part of any peace agreement.
Right. So there's now, I think that the whole map of Russia will then have to change if it's going to stay the same. There is going to be a sliver of land that connects Russia all the way from Russian territory through eastern Ukraine to the Black Sea port to Crimea. Now, this war has been going on for 3 years now, as we've been talking about it, Stanley. And going by what US President Donald Trump has been saying when after the meeting, a phone call with Putin, and then they've been meeting in Riyadh as well, US and Russian diplomats, that he's been saying it could end in a matter of weeks. Do you think this is in the realm of possibility? Could we have peace returning to Ukraine in as little as a few weeks, maybe 2, 3 weeks?
See, Trump seems determined to strike a deal with the Russians to bring the war to an end. That's one thing. Because just take a look what happened over the past 5 weeks. Because before the Trump administration came to power, Trump had promised that he will bring the war to an end. But the Russians had their own preconditions to start even negotiations because, as we just discussed, the Russians they had an upper hand. They have an upper hand in the battlefield. So they are not in a hurry to make peace, right? So they had their own preconditions. And what are those preconditions? They said that we are not going to leave the territories we have annexed. In their language, the territories that became part of Russia. And then, second is that Ukraine has to be neutral. Neutrality is a precondition. And the third, no foreign troops in Ukraine. So the Russians had clearly, President Putin had himself had made these preconditions clear. And then what happened at the Ukrainian Defense Group, Contact Group, when Pete Hegseth, Trump's defense secretary, he was addressing the Europeans, he basically addressed all these Russian preconditions publicly. So the Americans said that Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is not an eventual outcome. So basically, they have ruled out NATO membership. He also said that it's not practical to argue that Ukraine would be able to take back the territories, which means, again, they have basically accepted the Russian line that the territories taken by the Russians would be Russian. And he also said that any security guarantee for Ukraine should come from Europe, not from the United States. And United States, under any circumstance, would not deploy troops to Ukraine. This is what Peter Hegseth said. And he also added that even if the Europeans are sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, that would not be covered under Article 5 of NATO, which is the collective security clause. So basically, the Trump administration was saying that Ukraine would not get the territories back, Ukraine would not be inducted into NATO, and any security guarantees for Ukraine would not be covered under NATO. So they accepted all the Russian preconditions. This was a remarkable turnaround of the developments. And then President Trump himself, and after this, you had the Riyadh meeting between the Russians and the Americans. So before that, the Americans had already laid down all this. They had accepted all the Russian precondition. And after the Riyadh talks, President Trump says that there is a possibility to bring the war to an end. So it is possible that there is some kind of an agreement. But there are still stumbling blocks because the Americans have accepted the Russian precondition. But at the same time, the question is how they are going to address European security concerns or Ukraine's own security concerns. Because at the end of the day, if you want a ceasefire, because as of now, the Europeans have been excluded from the talks, Ukrainians have been excluded. But if you want a lasting ceasefire at some stage of the direct US-Russian negotiations, at some stage, you need to bring the Europeans and the Ukrainians in. This is one of the challenges President Trump is facing now. But at the outset, I would argue that he seems pretty determined that he wants to strike a deal directly with Putin and bring the war to an end.
Right. Now, Stanley, we know that Trump is a deal maker, and at the same time, we've also seen that he's been really quick and eager to sort of pursue peace in Ukraine. As you sort of really explained so well, he has agreed to all the three basic preconditions of Russia, which is about Ukraine cannot join NATO, Ukraine cannot expect back the territories it has lost, and no foreign troops in Ukraine. And whatever troops are there, they're not going to come with the NATO guarantees, etc., etc. So now, what exactly is Trump's interest here? Some people are talking about him wanting to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Is that really it, or is there something else that is going on? Why is he so desperate? He's not. We know that he's not someone who's a big champion of peace. That's pretty evident. Nor is it about getting something else, which is very obvious. So what exactly is the deal that he's good? What is he going to get out of this deal with Putin? Is it the economic deals that he's talking about with Russia? What are these economic deals that you think is happening behind the scenes?
So it's very difficult to understand what Trump is going to get out of it, and it's also very difficult to understand Trump's strategic thinking. You know, but he's been critical of NATO. This is not something new. Trump's argument is that he had called Europeans freeloaders in the past, and NATO is basically the United States. It is as simple as that. And it made perfect sense for the United States to stay invested in NATO during the Cold War when the Americans saw the Soviet Union as their most important rival. Because the Americans wanted to check the Soviet influence and contain the Soviet Union. So it made sense for the United States to stay invested in the transatlantic alliance. That reality has changed. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the world was unipolar, the United States was in a position to continue to extend its influence. That it wanted to keep Europe under its wraps. And it this is the period when you saw NATO's unchecked expansion towards the east, which eventually provoked the Russians. That's also a reality. But the world is not unipolar anymore. If you go back and listen to Marco Rubio's speech in the Senate, Marco Rubio himself says that the world is multipolar today. So the United States is not in a position to, basically project its force like the way it used to do in 1991 or 1998 or 2003. So that world has changed. That is one thing. Secondly, China has risen as a major power. The United States basically wants to focus its resources on China, whether to make a deal with China or to basically compete with China in technology, in geopolitical competition, etc., etc. That is another thing. So the Trump administration, I'm trying to understand the strategic thinking behind this. The Trump administration thinks that this war that is going on in Ukraine, this has nothing to do with America's security. Trump himself said there is, in his own language, there is a big, beautiful ocean between us and Europe. He was referring to the Atlantic Ocean. This takes us back to basically the pre-World War American foreign policy of offshore balancing. Because the pre-World War American strategists argued that the United States is a country that's blessed by geography, protected by the world's two largest oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. So that is what is making invading America a nightmare for any country. Nobody has invaded America except the Pearl Harbor attack and the 9/11 attack, because the United States has been basically protected by these two big oceans. So Trump's argument is a very nationalist argument. Some people call it isolationist. This is basically offshore balancing. His argument is that this war in Ukraine has nothing directly to do with American security. So why should the United States stay engaged in this? This is Europe's problem. And secondly, he has to deal with the Chinese. And to deal with the Chinese, he basically needs to release American resources. Why should the United States spend more than $100 billion on Ukraine in a war which the Ukrainians are not winning? If you go and check Vice President J.D. Vance's comment on the war, he says the Russians have a numerical advantage. Even with the American support, J.D. Vance argued that there is no clear path for Ukraine to win this war. So, if you put all these things together, Ukraine is not winning the war with or without American support. And NATO is basically a relic of Cold War, which continued to stay relevant, but the United States is, at least the Trump administration, is not as welcoming to the idea of this transatlantic alliance. And the US wants to focus on China. And this is basically a nationalist government. If you put everything together, the United States, what the United States wants to do is to basically do a reverse Kissinger with the Russians, something like what the Americans did in the 1970s with the Chinese when they saw the Soviet Union as their most important ally. They wanted to bring in some kind of rupture between the Chinese and the Soviets, and they reached out to the Chinese. So the Americans now think that the reality has changed. So they need some kind of a better, stable, predictable relationship with Russians, and they can focus on their main rival China. And also, they don't want to stay engaged in Europe's troubles forever. I think this is the strategic thinking behind what the Trump administration is trying to do now.
Right. So, in other words, you're saying that this reverse Kissinger with the Russian, I think, could be probably the fulcrum of their foreign policy, especially given the context of a rising China. If China is your main geopolitical rival, then I guess it makes sense not to sort of fritter away your resources in a war with Russia, where your stakes are pretty low or non-existent, which is how Trump seems to view it. Now, at the same time, Stanley, Trump has also negotiated with one of the two parties to the war, that is Ukraine, some kind of a deal for extraction of rare earth minerals, which is of course very important in this age of artificial intelligence and all this chip-driven digital economy. So, how do you see these rare earth minerals being something which is also of strategic importance for all superpowers? Where does this deal come into the picture? How do you read that? Because that is also happening simultaneously as part of this entire winding down the war scenario.
Apparently the deal is being signed today, February 28th, Friday in Washington. This is what President Trump has said. Zelensky is expected to meet him in the White House today, and they will finalize the details. So we don't have the fine print of the agreement. What we know, based on the statements issued by President Trump and Zelensky and his prime minister, is that they are going to set up a fund, and the United and Ukraine would contribute 50% of the fund. We don't know whether the fund will be completely owned by the United States or partly owned by the United States, but Ukraine is going to contribute half of this fund. And this fund is being set up basically to extract Ukrainian mineral resources as well as oil and gas. So this fund is what is going to drive the extraction going forward. I mean, at least when it comes to new projects. This is what Financial Times reported. I'm talking because we don't have the fine exact details. But here the problem is that when Trump proposed the agreement, many people thought that this is some kind of an agreement for continued American support for Ukraine or American security guarantees for Ukraine. Zelensky's immediate response when Trump said that America needs access to at least half of Ukrainian resources, Zelensky said that we are open to make a deal with the Americans, but in return we need security guarantees. This is what he said. But Pete Hegseth already said that there won't be any security guarantees for Ukraine. And Zelensky himself said yesterday, he said that the basic framework of an economic agreement between the United States and Ukraine has been agreed. We will finalize the details once I meet President Trump in the White House on February 28th. But as of now, there are no security guarantees. Financial Times reviewed the first draft of the agreement, the framework agreement. Financial Times also reported that there is no security guarantee as part of the agreement. So basically, what Ukraine is doing is to give away or give access to the United States or American corporations to its mineral resources in return for nothing. We don't know whether eventually they will get something or they might get some weapons from the United States. We don't know, but at least there are no security guarantees from Washington. This is the agreement. And also, how Trump is pitching this deal to his electorate, his voters, or to the Americans is that he is not saying that this deal is for continued American military support for Ukraine, but this deal is to recoup some of the dollars which the United States spent on Ukraine. Trump says $200 billion. Ukraine says $60 billion. Whatever it is, we don't know. But the United States had provided military and financial aid worth billions of dollars to Ukraine over the last 3 years, mainly under Biden administration. So Trump is now saying that we need to get the money back. And to get the money back, he is forcing the Ukrainians to sign this agreement. So, in the hindsight, what's happening? In the battlefield, Ukraine is losing territories, it is losing men, it's not getting NATO membership, and on the economic sphere, it is practically losing control over, at least partly, control over its own resources to the other side.
Right. So, Stanley, NATO membership is off the table. I mean, you have lost about one-fifth of your territory. You've lost a lot of your infrastructure is sort of severely devastated by the Russian bombing and strikes. You have lost thousands of men in your army, in your troops. You have lost civilian lives. There's been tremendous amount of displacement. Your economy is in a shambles, and you have signed away possibly a significant chunk of your rare earth mineral resources, which are like really in high demand, high value. So, what, if anything, has Ukraine gained at all after 3 years of fighting for its sovereignty? I mean, everybody said sovereignty, especially on European soil, is sort of untouchable. You can't really get away with invading another country. So we will fight. It has fought for 3 years. So much of devastation and loss has happened, and nobody would brook a different view on this, especially in Europe. I mean, uh, everything which was sort of seen as pragmatic or realistic was dismissed outright as conceding to Russia's territorial ambitions. They were talking about rewarding Russia for breaking international law. So now, what exactly is this that is likely to come through, if not, in effect, rewarding Russia for breaking international law? What, if anything, is Ukraine going to gain from whatever might be the outcome of the negotiations?
The sad reality is that Ukraine is not going to gain anything. As you pointed out, Ukraine has lost more than 20% of its territories, and if the war continues, it is likely to lose more. Millions of Ukrainians have fled the country. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the war, and its economy is in complete shambles. And it was continuing to fight mainly because of the financial and military aid that was coming from the West. And now that Trump is in the White House, there is a big question mark over that as well. And if the Americans are not going to provide any security guarantee, nobody is going to send troops to Ukraine. Keir Starmer now says that he is willing to send troops, but those troops will come only with American security guarantees. I'm telling you. France is not going to do this. Germany is not going to do this, because if they are going to do this, German, French, and British soldiers are going to get killed in Ukraine if the war continues. So they might issue brave statements today, but they are not going to do that unless NATO is involved. So at the end of the day, Ukraine has got nothing. It has only suffered. And on the other side, above all this, they are going to lose their own mineral resources to the United States. Or France says they are also involved in talks with Ukraine to extract minerals. So Ukraine is in a very serious condition. In April 2023, a few months after the war in Istanbul, we had discussed this in our podcast earlier, that there was a possibility to reach an agreement. So the Russian invasion did not go as per Putin planned. I think that's not a secret anymore. He wanted to meet his objectives. That's why he didn't even call it a war. He called it a special military operation. He wanted to meet his objectives rather quickly, like in the case of Georgia or the annexation of Crimea. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians resisted, and the Russians didn't meet their immediate objectives, and the war went on. The Russians were not ready to fight such a long war. The Russians went to invade Ukraine with just 150,000 soldiers against a standing army of 400,000. That doesn't make any sense. So the Russians were actually open to cut a deal. So Lavrov has spoken about it. Naftali Bennett has spoken about it. Turkish diplomats have talked about it. And recently, Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy himself, had talked about it. Steve Witkoff said that both the Russians and the Ukrainians were in a very advanced stage of bringing the war to an end. Based on what? The Russians will withdraw from the territories they had captured, and then they will keep Crimea, and Ukraine will declare its neutrality. But then Boris Johnson would go to Kyiv and talk Zelensky out of the agreement, along with support from the Biden administration. They said never cut a deal with the Russians. So that was the best chance for the Ukrainians to bring the war to an end. But Ukraine continued to fight only to lose more territories and men, right? And now they are in a very precarious situation because they can't continue to fight without getting help from the West. And you look at the Trump administration. It's not just it's not just grandstanding. There is a clear, remarkable shift in its policy because Trump said that Ukraine started the war, which is not right. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the subjectivity is with the subjective responsibility is with the Russians. Though we can argue that the Russians were provoked, that is a reality. But then in the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly, the resolution that the United States promoted did not call it an invasion. I remember having a conversation with an American diplomat sometime in early 2023. When I called it the Ukraine war, the diplomat told me, "Why do you call it a war? This is an unprovoked invasion by a dictatorial regime against a democratically elected country in Europe." So this was the standard response. And today, the Trump administration doesn't call it an invasion. If you go read the UN Security Council resolution, which actually got passed, the French and the British could actually veto it. They didn't do it. They abstained, letting the resolution pass. It called it the Russia-Ukraine conflict. This is how the Trump administration position has changed. So Ukraine is in a very, very bad situation. Zelensky is, the wall is closing in on him. I hope he realizes the situation he is in.
Would it be fair to say that Zelensky has been a disaster for Ukraine? I mean, he's the worst leader for the country could have ever had in terms of in its entire modern history?
Yeah, we can say that Zelensky is a strategic disaster because there was no chance for Ukraine to win this war. And there was a possibility to shut the war in 2022 itself. He did not take that. He actually played along, thinking that assistance from the West would continue to flow in. So basically, he has contracted out the responsibility to defend Ukraine to Western aid. That I think that is poor strategy. So Ukraine, I would argue, from a realist point of view, Ukraine would go down in history as a lesson for countries to avoid proxy conflicts, not to get caught in proxy wars between great powers. Because great powers fight, great powers may compromise, and countries who get stuck in proxy wars will always suffer. Ukraine, the same thing is happening with Ukraine as well.
Right. I mean, that's, I think, a very strong lesson and a huge price to pay to learn this lesson. I mean, there's no doubt, as you said, Zelensky has been a strategic disaster for Ukraine. And I think other countries would also learn not only from the fact that a proxy war is a disaster, but also in terms of how having a bad leader at the helm of your country could prove a huge disaster going forward for that nation, the economy, for the people, in ways they can't even imagine. Thank you so much, Stanley. That's all I have for you this week. We will hopefully get back and talk about this sometime soon once there is a peace deal in the making. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Ambat. Pleasure talking to
you. In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.